This is a short video talking about the Wabash River case study for this week. Now, the Wabash River is a river that's really important to me personally. This is the river I grew up along. And one of the things that makes the Wabash River interesting is showcased here in the picture on the left. The Wabash River is a large undammed river, meaning about over 410 miles of free-flowing river that floods on a regular cycle. What that means is that as you look to the map on the right, that a lot of that green area that you see along these stream corridors realistically is active floodway, meaning that at least once a year you're going to see full inundation. And in years with larger storm pushes, that storm events, that's what I'm looking for, you're going to see a lot more floodwaters moving through there. That keeps development back. It keeps, but it also keeps people away from the river. Building a relationship with the river was a big part of what was going on with developing the Wabash River Greenway project. Much like we talk about with many of our planning classes, it all begins with getting people involved. And so to give you an idea of some of the many attempts to get people more engaged with this river, I just went ahead and pulled a collection of some of the pictures I've taken over the years. On the top left, you're actually going to see three individuals answering questions. It was basically set up as a Jeopardy style game to answer questions about the Wabash River. What made it unique is that this actually happened to be the political leadership, the mayors of the local communities, a county leader, an elected county leader position as well. And you know what? They didn't have all the answers. And that was part of the point. Was the community had a low level of awareness, a low level of understanding. How could we get people to admit that it's okay not to know everything about this river, but to get in and get engaged? As you move to the next picture on the top right, you see a woman looking at the map intently, and what we were actually doing there is collecting local knowledge. She was placing part of her story onto a large map of the river to tell us what it means to her. As we drop down to the bottom right, you'll see somebody that's doing water quality sampling in one of the local streams. This was a big part of getting the community engaged in this project, as most people didn't spend time in the river. They didn't swim there, they didn't fish there, they didn't boat there, right? They weren't engaged with it, and they all believed that it was really dirty. As this progressed, we got to a point where on 4 Saturdays a year, there would be called a community sampling blitz that would bring people out. And in this case, in some, hundreds of people. We would actually sample more than 60 locations across the county, each with a team of between 5 and 15 people. And so you can see 500 people for a sampling event wasn't too bad. And what they learned is that in most cases, the water wasn't as dirty as they thought it was. And as you move down to the bottom, lots of educational activities about things that can be done both in urban and in rural settings to help improve water quality in the Wabash River. The next sequence of slides really goes ahead and just connects to some of the planning work that was being done by Wallace, Roberts, and Todd as part of the Greenway Development Project, primarily focusing on visualizing changes within the urban core. Lots of the rest of the project kind of occurred in the broader landscape, but a lot of this attention came back to this river and how the communities interfaced with this river. One thing to note on this particular side is right down the right-hand side, on the east side of the river, you'll actually see that it looks like a line of development running right along through the community and snaking its way up close to the river. And what you're actually seeing there is a railroad corridor. And if you go back to when I was a teenager living in this community, the community completed what at that time had been a 30-year project to move the railroad corridor from within the urban parts of downtown. Basically, the railroads ran right down the middle of a street. They'd actually pushed it down to the river, and in doing so, they cut themselves off from the river. There's now about a 80 to 100-foot railroad corridor that separates downtown from the riverfront. That relationship had to change. And this is a before. So you can start to see some of the uses that had made their way down to the river. And so again, kind of in the foreground, right here on the bottom side of the river, the bottom side of the image where the river comes through is that rail corridor. But as you look across, what you're actually starting to see is looking up the hill towards Purdue University. On the left-hand side, you see that you have a water treatment facility, and then down below it says boxboard site. This is actually an old paper recycling plant, and so big industrial, heavy water usage, very polluted. Not much access. You can see all the way along here, very little access to the river itself. We started talking about how this had to change. New development. Focusing on access. These are all parts of the process that this community went through to get to this point. So as we come down into this, you start to look at, how do we enhance the community's connection and its relationship with the river. Well, one of the things that changed over time is right in the middle of the picture where it actually says Wabash Landing and it says the depot. Basically, that's two sides of the river that are connected by what looks like a bridge, and for some reason there's weird circles that are sticking off of it. I think that was some kind of artistic vision to talk about gathering points for people. But really what this is that's the old vehicle bridge that connected the two sides of the river. And when it came out of commission and they built a new bridge, what they did is they turned that into a pedestrian space. Right? A pedestrian bridge standing across the river, on one side of the river with no development. On the other side of the river, there's a railroad corridor. We had just spent $200 million relocating down there. Again, there's challenges that sit there. How do you bring people back to it? Well, you start to see the programming behind this. They brought in retail and they brought in housing, and they started focusing on developing parks and activity, right? How do we bring people back to this space? And this is just a clearer view of what you saw in the last slide. And again, what I wanted to highlight here is that a river without a community, meaning that realistically a bunch of parking lots on what is now on the top side of the river. It's actually the west side, but we're looking to the west in this image. A bunch of parking lots and unused retail space wasn't cutting it. There was no center of activity, no node that drew people down here. So as much as a pedestrian bridge wanted to connect to the downtown, to where people wanted to spend time, no one was there. As we kind of look over to the left-hand side of the image, you go past the wastewater treatment facility, and suddenly they're starting to show the potential for trails and access features, right? The idea that we can get people's eyes on the river, get more people down here to kind of reclaim the space and energize it. Leaving it alone, it just isn't an option in terms of, it becomes a place that's uninviting, it becomes a place that realistically is unsafe. Those are all challenges that this plan is starting to resolve as part of the Greenway. In this slide, we're starting to look to the far north end of downtown, so we're starting to move beyond it. You kind of see at the very bottom of the screen, or the image, you're seeing kind of the downtown, that connection I've been focused on. But one of the things I want you to look up towards the top, it says 52 Bridge, which is a highway overpass, and then it says golf course. You see all of that open space up there that's a golf course. And remember what I said about this river. This river floods. And that entire golf course actually was going underwater at least once, if not 2 or 3 times in a year. And it was a municipal owned, meaning the city actually owned the golf course. But they continued to replant it. And they continued to focus on its long-term future as a golf course, because that's what you do with that space. People love that golf course. They were attached to it. That's what we heard meeting after meeting after meeting. But golf courses and the fertilizer applications contribute to problems in the river. Right? Runoff, stormwater management, the lack of access. A golf course is not an inviting public space that says, come, spend time out here and interact with the river. There were competing visions for the future of what that space could be. And again, that focus on keeping the golf course in place survived the planning process. We have to keep the golf course where it is. The golf course has to be there. This is the thing about a community vision, about a changing relationship between people and their river, people and the resource, people trying to connect, is that a year after this plan was approved, after WRT had wrapped up and left town, the city of Lafayette was approached with an offer. And the offer was, you can buy another golf course. It's a private country club for $1, with one condition, and that condition being that you must vacate the municipal golf course down along the river. And you know what? That changed everything. No longer was the city completely divorcing itself from the programming and the recreational access of an affordable municipal golf course, but they were also resolving a budget problem of having to replant a golf course that flooded year upon year upon year. And suddenly now that even though we've walked our way through the planning process and we've arrived here at the other end, the golf course becomes a symbol of how communities have to struggle with creating that long-term vision of the social process of getting there. No one had been talking about getting rid of the golf course until we started talking about the future of the river. But once that conversation got started, somebody within the community who was in a position to make decisions figured out that they could make this offer to the city to get them to, move the golf course to a better location, to move it to a place that was more sustainable. And in the meantime, what they've done is they've opened up this floodway, opened it up for trail development, opened it up for nature park restoration. That's the direction that the community is moving on this, and it's an exciting one to see. Something that was unchangeable. This is a mandate of the planning process that will stay in place. That shifted in about 8 years. and now we're headed in a completely different direction. That's what's exciting about this kind of planning. And one of the reasons, and I'm circling back to this intentionally, one of the reasons that this plan has been successful, one of the reasons that they're now actually talking about decking over part of the railroad corridor to get better access to the river itself, one of the reasons you're seeing revitalization and redevelopment efforts within the urban core comes back to a community getting together and starting to care about a problem. A lot of these ideas were talked around as people dreaming, people talking about the future, people coming together. What they were really doing was developing a common definition of how the river influenced the future of the community and making an investment in that. This is a long-term process. This particular river has come a long way in my mind, but also in the mind of people within the community. And I went ahead, and because it's a video, I went ahead and cut out all the work we did with surveys and community attitudes, but those are important too because it tells a changing story of the history of this river. This community had clearly turned its back on the river for decades. This community is now headed in a direction where the river is their selling point. The river is a resource to be built upon. The river is how the two communities are interfacing with one another to develop common recreational and open space features. It's an important shift, and it all begins with planners starting to ask the right questions, engaging with the public, starting to look for a future vision or shared future vision for their community and their resources.